The sun hung low over the New Mexico desert, casting long shadows across the parched earth that stretched endlessly toward the distant mesas. Eleanor Hayes stood on the weathered porch of her cabin, one hand shading her eyes as she gazed at the horizon where her husband used to appear each evening, riding home from the cattle ranges. That was before the fever took him, before the land seemed to grow even drier, before the silence became so complete it rang in her ears like church bells. At 36, Eleanor was neither young nor old by frontier standards, but widowhood had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with the lines around her eyes or the calluses on her hands. Her dark hair, once carefully pinned, now hung in a simple braid down her back. Her dress, made from fabric bought in better times, bore the patches and mends of a woman who had learned to make do. The cabin itself seemed to mirror her state, still standing, still functional, but showing the wear of neglect. Shingles had blown off during last winter's storms, leaving gaps where rain could seep through. The fence posts leaned at tired angles, and the chicken coop door hung askew on its hinges. Without Thomas, without his broad shoulders and steady hands, the homestead was slowly surrendering to the desert. Eleanor turned and went inside, her boots echoing hollowly on the wooden floors. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor all in one. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold now in the summer heat. She moved to the heavy oak table where she kept her accounts, spreading out the worn ledger that told the story of her decline in neat columns of figures. $50. That's what remained of their life savings, of Thomas's dream of building a proper ranch. $50 between her and complete ruin. She'd sold the good horses already, keeping only the old mare that was more pet than working animal. The cattle were gone too, picked off by drought, disease, and wolves. Even the wedding china her mother had given her had been traded for flour and coffee at Morrison's store in town. The walk to Coyote Creek took her an hour in the morning heat. The town, if it could be called that, consisted of a dozen buildings clustered around a dusty main street. Morrison's general store anchored one end, the Broken Wheel Saloon the other, with various shops and services scattered between. As Eleanor made her way down the street, she felt the familiar weight of eyes upon her. "There goes the Hayes widow," she heard Mrs. Morrison whisper to her daughter as they swept the store's front steps. "Poor thing, out here all alone. No children to care for her, no family to take her in. Shameful is what it is," the daughter replied, not bothering to lower her voice. "A woman her age, living alone like that, it ain't natural." Eleanor kept her chin high and her pace steady. Though each word struck like a small stone, she'd grown accustomed to the whispers, the sidelong glances, the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, in a place where a woman's worth was measured by her husband and children. She had neither. The Broken Wheel was dim and sour-smelling, a refuge for men who had nowhere else to be in the middle of the day. Eleanor rarely entered such establishments, but desperation had its own rules. She pushed through the swinging doors, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the gloom. Jake Henson, the barkeeper, looked up in surprise. "Mrs. Hayes, something wrong?" "I need to hire a hand for the summer," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "A man who can work hard and knows his way around a homestead." The few patrons in the saloon turned to stare. A woman entering a saloon was unusual enough. A widow looking to hire strange men was practically scandalous. "Don't know of anyone offhand," Jake said carefully. "Most of the good workers are already spoken for this time of year." Eleanor reached into her pocket and placed a silver dollar on the bar. "I'm willing to pay $50 for the season. Cash money, room and board included." A low whistle came from somewhere in the shadows. $50 was good money, enough to tempt even employed men to break their contracts. But it was also every cent Eleanor had, a fact she kept to herself. "That's generous." Jake admitted, "I'll spread the word. You might try the boarding house too. Sometimes drifters looking for work stay there." Eleanor nodded and turned to leave, then stopped. In the far corner, barely visible in the shadows, sat a young man she hadn't noticed before. He was lean and dust-covered, with the look of someone who'd been riding hard for days. His hat was pulled low, but she could see sharp cheekbones and a jaw roughened by several days' growth of beard. What struck her most were his eyes, gray as winter sky, holding a weight that seemed beyond his years. He'd been watching her, she realized, but not with the leering interest of some men or the dismissive contempt of others. His gaze was thoughtful, calculating, as if he were taking her measure just as she was taking his. "You," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Are you looking for work?" The stranger set down his whiskey glass with deliberate slowness. "Might be," he said. His voice was low, roughened by trail dust. "Depends on the work. Ranch work, mending fences, tending what stock I have left, general repairs. It's hard labor, and the accommodations are simple. And the pay is $50 for the summer." "That's right, plus meals and a roof over your head." He studied her for a long moment. Around them, the other men watched with undisguised interest. This would be gossip for weeks. The Hayes widow hiring a strange drifter right out of a saloon. "Name's Caleb Turner," he said finally. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow, if you're willing. My place is 5 miles north, where Cottonwood Creek used to run. Anyone can point you the way." He touched the brim of his hat. "I'll be there at sunrise, ma'am." Eleanor left the saloon with her head high, though she could feel the town's judgment settling over her like dust. By evening, everyone would know what she'd done. The proper ladies would clutch their pearls and whisper about propriety. The men would make crude jokes and place bets on how long before scandal erupted. But as she walked back to her empty cabin, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in months. A tiny spark of hope. It was probably foolish. Hiring a man she knew nothing about save his name. He could be a thief, a drunk, or worse. But she was out of options, out of time, and very nearly out of faith. That night, she lay in her narrow bed listening to coyotes howl in the distance. The sound used to frighten her when she first came here as Thomas's bride, fresh from Missouri with romantic notions about frontier life. Now it was just another voice in the desert's nightly chorus, no more threatening than the wind rattling the loose shutters. Tomorrow, a stranger would ride up to her door. Tomorrow, the tongues would wag even harder. Tomorrow, she would either save her homestead or lose everything on one last desperate gamble. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to imagine what Thomas would say about her decision. But his voice, once so clear in her memory, had faded like everything else, leaving only silence and the endless whisper of sand against wood. The sky was still purple-gray when Eleanor heard the sound of hooves approaching. She'd been awake for an hour already, moving about the kitchen in the pre-dawn darkness, her hands performing the familiar ritual of making coffee and biscuits. Through the window, she watched a lone rider emerge from the desert haze, moving with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more nights under stars than roofs. Caleb Turner looked different in the morning light. The shadows that had obscured him in the saloon were gone, revealing a man perhaps 24 or 25 years old. His clothes were worn but clean. He must have stopped at the creek to wash off the trail dust. His horse was a sturdy bay gelding, not fancy but well cared for, with the kind of deep chest and strong legs that could carry a man for miles without complaint. Eleanor stepped onto the porch as he dismounted. Up close, she could see the details she'd missed before: a thin scar along his left jawline, hands that were calloused but surprisingly gentle as he loosened his horse's girth, and those gray eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, touching his hat brim. "I'm here as promised." "Mr. Turner." She nodded, trying to project an authority she didn't quite feel. "I'll show you where you can stable your horse. Then we can discuss the work." The barn was one of the few structures Thomas had built solid enough to withstand the desert's assault. As Caleb led his horse inside, Eleanor noticed how he checked the stall carefully before entering, how his eyes swept the rafters and corners. It was the wariness of a man who'd learned not to take safety for granted. "Been traveling long?" she asked. "Long enough." He began unsaddling with practiced efficiency. "Came up from Texas way, heard there might be work in New Mexico. And before Texas..." His hands paused for just a moment on the saddle blanket. "Here and there. I don't stay put long, usually." Eleanor recognized a boundary when she met one. "Well, I need someone who can stay put for the summer. At least, can you do that?" "For $50 and fair treatment. Yes, ma'am, I can." She showed him the small room attached to the barn that would serve as his quarters. It held a narrow cot, a washstand, and not much else. Caleb set his saddlebags down without comment, though she caught him testing the straw mattress with one hand. "It's not much," Eleanor said, suddenly aware of how meager her hospitality must seem. "It's private and it's dry," he replied. "That's more than many bunkhouses I've seen." They walked the property as the sun climbed higher, Eleanor pointing out what needed doing. The list was dishearteningly long sections of fence that had collapsed entirely, the chicken coop that needed rebuilding, the well that required deepening, the roof that leaked, the garden plot that had been reclaimed by desert scrub. Caleb listened without interrupting, occasionally kneeling to examine a broken fence post or studying the angle of the sagging roof. His silence made Eleanor nervous. She found herself talking more than necessary, explaining how Thomas had planned to expand the corral, how they'd once had 40 head of cattle, how the creek used to run year-round before the drought. "Your husband," Caleb said finally. "How long ago did he pass?" 8 months. The words still felt strange in her mouth. "Fever took him last September. Doctor said there was nothing to be done. I'm sorry for your loss." It was a simple statement, but something in his tone suggested he understood loss himself. Eleanor wondered what ghosts followed Caleb Turner through the desert nights. "I'll need tools," he said, bringing them back to practical matters. "What do you have?" The tool shed yielded a decent collection. Thomas had been particular about his equipment. Caleb examined each piece carefully, testing hammerheads and axe blades, checking handles for cracks. He worked with a quiet concentration that Eleanor found oddly soothing. "This'll do fine," he said finally. "I'll start with the fence around the garden plot. No point planting if the rabbits and deer can walk right in." Eleanor left him to his work and returned to the house. From the kitchen window, she could watch him moving about the property. He'd stripped down to his shirt sleeves, revealing arms corded with lean muscle. He worked steadily but didn't rush, measuring twice before cutting, setting posts deep and true. At noon, she called him in for the midday meal. She'd prepared more than usual: bacon, beans, cornbread, and the last of her preserved peaches. Caleb washed at the pump before entering, scrubbing the dirt from his hands and face. "You don't need to go to this trouble," he said, eyeing the spread on the table. "I'm hired help. I can eat in the barn." "In my house, anyone who works hard eats well," Eleanor replied firmly. "Sit." They ate in companionable silence at first. Caleb had good manners. She noticed he handled his fork properly and didn't wolf down his food like some ranch hands she'd seen. When he complimented the cornbread, she felt an unexpected warmth in her cheeks. "Where'd you learn fence work?" she asked. "My father, originally, then various ranches between here and California." He paused, considering his next words. "I've been working other people's land since I was 15. Never had a place of my own. By choice. By circumstance." He met her eyes briefly. "Some folks are meant to settle. Others are meant to keep moving." "And which are you?" "Haven't decided yet." After the meal, he returned to work without prompting. Eleanor found herself inventing reasons to be outside, checking the chickens, working in what remained of the garden, hanging laundry that could have waited until tomorrow. Each time she glanced his way, Caleb was focused on his task, methodical and thorough. As the afternoon wore on, She noticed other things about him. The way he talked quietly to his horse when he thought no one was listening. How he automatically checked the horizon every few minutes. A habit of men who'd learned to watch for trouble. The careful way he handled Thomas's tools, with the respect of someone who understood their value. When the sun began sinking toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Caleb set down his tools and surveyed his progress. A good section of fence stood straight and strong, posts set deep enough to withstand the wind. "That's a good day's work," Eleanor said, approaching with a pitcher of water. He accepted the drink gratefully, throat working as he swallowed. A drop of water escaped, trailing down his neck, and Eleanor found herself looking away, disturbed by the sudden intimacy of the moment. "I'll have this section finished tomorrow," he said. "Then I'll start on the chicken coop. Those birds deserve better than what they've got." Eleanor almost smiled. "They're cantankerous creatures. They might not appreciate your efforts." "Most creatures don't appreciate what's done for them," Caleb replied. "Doesn't mean it shouldn't be done." As he headed to the barn to tend his horse, Eleanor watched him go. There was something about the way he moved. Not cocky like some young cowboys. Not defeated like men who'd been broken by the frontier. He carried himself like someone who'd learned to bend without breaking, to endure without surrendering. That evening, she prepared a simple supper and carried it out to the barn, finding him sitting outside his room, cleaning his boots by lamplight. "Though you might be hungry," she said, setting down the tray. "You're generous, Mrs. Hayes, more than you need to be." "It's practical," she countered. "A well-fed worker is an efficient worker." He looked up at her then, and in the lamplight she caught something in his expression, not quite a smile, but a softening around his eyes. "If you say so, ma'am." As she walked back to the house, Eleanor realized the evening felt different somehow. The familiar weight of loneliness hadn't settled over her shoulders as usual. The cabin ahead didn't seem quite as empty knowing there was someone else on the property. Another human presence to break the desert's vast solitude. She paused on the porch, looking back at the barn where lamplight spilled from Caleb's window. Tomorrow, the town gossips would start their work in earnest. Tomorrow, she'd have to face the consequences of her choice. But tonight, for the first time in 8 months, Eleanor Hayes didn't feel entirely alone. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Somewhere in the darkness, a nighthawk called, and in the barn, a young drifter with old eyes cleaned his boots and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. Hiring on with a widow whose determination shone fiercer than the desert's sun. The days fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Caleb rose before dawn, the sound of his movements in the barn becoming as familiar to Eleanor as the morning bird song. By the time she had coffee brewing, he'd already be out checking the animals or studying whatever project he'd planned for the day. They'd share a quiet breakfast. Then he'd head out to work while she tended to the household tasks that never seemed to end. The fence around the garden plot was completed in 3 days. Next came the chicken coop, rebuilt sturdy enough to withstand both weather and the occasional coyote. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as Caleb worked, noting the careful way he measured each board. The patience with which he taught the old rooster to trust him enough to be moved to temporary quarters. "That bird's got more pride than sense," Caleb said one evening, sporting a fresh scratch on his hand from the rooster's spurs. "Thomas used to say the same thing," Eleanor replied, dabbing the wound with iodine. "Said he was too tough for the stew pot and too mean for anything else." She felt Caleb go still under her touch, and realized it was the first time she'd tended to him this way. Her fingers on his skin felt too intimate, too familiar, and she quickly finished and stepped back. "There, try to keep it clean." "Yes, ma'am." His voice was rougher than usual. "Thank you." As the days passed, Eleanor found herself noticing more about her hired hand, the way he always knocked before entering the house, even when she'd called him for meals. How he'd mended her clothesline without being asked, setting the posts straighter than they'd ever been. The books she'd spotted in his saddlebags, worn copies of things she wouldn't have expected a drifting cowboy to carry. One evening, curiosity got the better of her. "I saw you reading last night, the lamplight from your window." Caleb looked up from his plate, something guarded in his expression. "Does that bother you?" "No, I'm just surprised. Not many ranch hands carry books in their gear. My mother taught me to read when I was young. Said it was the one thing nobody could take away from you." He paused, then added, "She was a school teacher before she married my father. Died when I was 12. Consumption." Eleanor knew better than to push further. But that night, she gathered some of Thomas's books, volumes of poetry, a few novels, a history of the Roman Empire he'd been particularly fond of, and left them outside Caleb's door. The next morning, they were gone, though he said nothing about them. The work continued. Caleb repaired the sagging porch steps, patched the worst of the roof leaks, and reinforced the door to the root cellar. He worked with a quiet efficiency that reminded Eleanor of Thomas in some ways, though the resemblance ended there, where Thomas had been broad and loud, full of grand plans and hearty laughter. Caleb was lean and quiet, thoughtful in his movements. Some days they worked side by side. When he dug new irrigation channels for the garden, she followed behind, planting the seeds she'd saved from last year. When he repaired the corral fence, she helped hold the posts steady. These shared tasks became oddly companionable, filled with comfortable silences broken only by necessary words. "Hand me that hammer." "Hold this steady while I nail it." "Looks like rain coming." It was during one of these shared tasks that Eleanor first heard Caleb laugh. They were trying to corner a stubborn goat that had taken to jumping the fence, and the animal led them on a merry chase around the property. Finally, covered in dust and thoroughly winded, they collapsed against the barn wall in defeat, while the goat watched them with satisfied eyes. "I think," Caleb said between breaths, "that goat's got more brains than both of us combined." And then he laughed, not loud or long, but genuine, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Eleanor found herself laughing too, and for a moment the weight she'd carried for 8 months lifted just a little. The nights were harder. After supper, Caleb would retreat to his quarters and Eleanor would be left with the empty house and her memories. Sometimes she'd see his lamp burning late and wonder what he was reading, what thoughts kept him awake. Sometimes she'd step out onto the porch and find him sitting there too, smoking a cigarette and watching the stars. "Can't sleep?" she asked one such night, wrapping her shawl tighter against the desert chill. "Just thinking." He shifted over on the step, a silent invitation. "You?" "The house feels too quiet sometimes." She sat down, careful to leave proper space between them. "Thomas used to snore something terrible, used to drive me half mad. Now I'd give anything to hear it again." "How long were you married?" 12 years. We came out here from Missouri right after the wedding. He had such dreams about what we'd build." She gestured at the modest homestead. "This wasn't quite what he envisioned." "Seems like he built something good," Caleb said quietly. "A home, a life with someone who still mourns him. That's more than many men manage." Eleanor studied his profile in the darkness. "What about you, ever been married?" "No." The word came quick and firm. "Never stayed anywhere long enough for that." "By choice or by circumstance?" She was echoing his own words from that first day. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Both, I suppose. Some things a man does make it hard to settle down." "What things?" He turned to look at her then, and in the moonlight, his eyes were unreadable. "The kind that follow you, misses, haze, the kind that make it better for everyone if you keep moving." Eleanor knew she should be frightened by this admission, should send him away immediately. A man with secrets, with a past that kept him running. It was dangerous, foolish to keep him here. But looking at him in the silver darkness, all she felt was a strange kinship. They were both carrying ghosts. After all. "Well," she said finally, You're not moving right now. That's something. No, he agreed softly. I'm not. They sat in silence until the chill drove Eleanor inside. But she paused at the door, looking back at where he still sat, a solitary figure against the vast desert night. Caleb. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the work you're doing. It means more than you know. He nodded slowly. Get some rest, Eleanor. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it hung in the air between them like a confession. Eleanor went inside quickly, her heart beating faster than it should. Through her bedroom window, she could see him still sitting on the porch, keeping watch over the darkness like a guardian she hadn't known she needed. The next morning, they were back to Mrs. Hayes and Ma'am, but something had shifted. The careful distance they'd maintained had narrowed just a fraction, and in that small space, something else was beginning to grow. Something fragile and unexpected, pushing up through the hard ground like the seeds in her newly fenced garden. Eleanor told herself it was just gratitude, just the natural response to having help after so long alone. But when she watched Caleb work, when she caught him smiling at something the goat did, when their fingers brushed as she handed him tools, she knew she was lying to herself. The desert had taken so much from her husband, her dreams, her certainty about the future, but now it had brought her this enigmatic young man with his careful hands and haunted eyes, and Eleanor didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified. Perhaps both, she thought, watching him coax the old mare to take apple slices from his palm. Perhaps both was exactly right. The storm announced itself with a wall of dust on the horizon, rolling across the desert like a brown avalanche. Eleanor had seen plenty of sandstorms in her years on the homestead, but this one looked different, darker, angrier, moving with a speed that set her nerves on edge. Caleb, she called from the porch, watching him working on the well pump 50 yards away. He looked up, following her pointing finger to the approaching wall of sand. He dropped his tools immediately and ran for the barn. Eleanor hurried to secure the shutters, her fingers fumbling with the latches as the wind began to pick up. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds, and the first stinging grains of sand hit her face like tiny needles. By the time she got the last shutter closed, the world outside had turned brown-black. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the walls and sending dust through every tiny gap in the wood. Eleanor lit the lamps with shaking hands, trying not to think about Caleb out in the barn, trying not to imagine the roof peeling away like paper. The storm intensified. Something heavy crashed against the side of the house, probably the old wagon wheel she'd been meaning to store properly. The whole structure groaned under the assault, and Eleanor found herself pressing against the wall as if she could hold it up through will alone. Then she heard it, a terrible splintering sound from the direction of the barn. The chicken coop. The new chicken coop Caleb had just finished building. Without thinking, she grabbed her shawl and headed for the door. The wind nearly tore it from her hands when she opened it. Sand filled her mouth and nose instantly, choking her. She couldn't see more than a foot ahead, but she knew the path to the barn by heart, fighting against the wind. She struggled forward, one hand stretched out blindly. Strong arms caught her halfway there. Caleb's voice in her ear, barely audible over the storm. "What are you doing? Get back inside." "The chickens," she shouted back. "I've got them go." But she clung to his arm, and together they battled their way to the barn. Inside. The noise was slightly muffled. Though dust swirled in the air like smoke, the chickens huddled in a corner, feathers ruffled, the rooster standing protectively in front of his hens. Caleb had managed to herd them inside just before the coop collapsed. "We need to secure them," Eleanor said, coughing. "They'll panic and hurt themselves." Working together in the dim light, they created a makeshift pen using feed sacks and old crates. Eleanor soothed the frightened birds while Caleb reinforced the barn doors, which were threatening to blow open. The horses stamped nervously in their stalls, and his bay gelding whinnied high and sharp. Easy, boy, Caleb murmured, moving to calm the animal. Just a little wind. We've weathered worse, haven't we? A particularly violent gust shook the entire structure. Dust rained down from the rafters, and somewhere overhead, something cracked ominously. The loft, Caleb said, looking up. If that beam goes... He didn't finish the sentence. Grabbing a rope, he climbed quickly up to the loft, disappearing into the swirling dust above. Eleanor heard him moving around, the scrape of wood against wood, his occasional curse when something didn't cooperate. Another crack, louder this time. Eleanor saw the massive support beam starting to bow, saw Caleb directly underneath it, trying to shore it up with a makeshift brace. "Get down from there!" she shouted. Either he didn't hear her or he ignored her. The beam groaned, sagged another inch. Without thinking, Eleanor grabbed the pitchfork and climbed after him, her skirts tangling dangerously on the ladder rungs. "What are you?" Caleb started to say. Then the beam shifted again, and there was no time for words. Together they wedged the pitchfork handle against the beam while Caleb hammered in a supporting plank. Dust filled their lungs, their eyes, coating everything in grit. Eleanor's arms shook with the effort of holding the heavy beam. Finally, miraculously, the support held. Caleb grabbed her arm and pulled her back toward the ladder. "Down, now!" They made it to the barn floor just as another section of the loft groaned and settled. Caleb pushed Eleanor into the small tack room and followed, slamming the door behind them. The tiny space was relatively sealed, the air clearer. They collapsed against opposite walls, gasping. "That was foolish," Caleb said when he could speak. His face was masked with dust except where sweat had tracked lines down his cheeks. "You could have been killed." "So could you," Eleanor shot back. "I wasn't going to stand by and watch it happen." They stared at each other across the narrow space. Eleanor became acutely aware of how small the room was, how close he sat, how his breathing hadn't quite steadied. Dust motes danced in the lamplight between them like tiny stars. "Eleanor," he said, and her name sounded different in his mouth, weighted with something she couldn't define. "You don't need to risk yourself for me. I'm just hired help." "No," she said firmly. "You're not anymore." The words hung between them, carrying more meaning than she'd intended. Caleb's gray eyes held hers, and for a moment the storm outside seemed distant, unimportant. He leaned forward slightly, and she found herself doing the same, drawn by something stronger than the wind that raged outside. The tack room door burst open, breaking the spell. Wind and dust swirled in, and they both scrambled to close it again. The moment was gone. But something had changed, something that couldn't be taken back. They waited out the storm in silence, sitting side by side now, backs against the wall. Sometimes Eleanor dozed, exhaustion overtaking her. And once she woke to find her head on Caleb's shoulder. She started to pull away, but he said quietly, "Rest. It's all right." Hours passed. The wind gradually began to die, its howl fading to a moan, then to whispers. When they finally ventured out, the world had been transformed. Drifts of sand piled against buildings like snow. The chicken coop was completely gone, scattered across the desert. Half the roof shingles from the house had vanished, but they were alive. The animals were safe. The barn and house still stood. "Well," Eleanor said, surveying the damage in the early dawn light, "I suppose we know what we're doing for the next few days." Caleb was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. "We?" he asked softly. "Unless you're planning to leave me to clean this up alone." "No." He turned to face the sunrise, which painted the dust-hazed sky in shades of rose and gold. "I'm not going anywhere." They worked through the day clearing sand, salvaging what they could of the chicken coop, patching the most critical damage. Their movements had a new synchronization, as if the night in the storm had taught them to anticipate each other. When Eleanor reached for a board, Caleb was already handing it to her. When he needed water, she was there with the bucket. That evening, exhausted and still gritty with dust despite their efforts to wash, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. The desert looked scoured clean, almost innocent, as if it hadn't tried to tear their world apart just hours before. "Thank you," Eleanor said, "for saving the animals, for keeping the barn standing." "Thank you for helping," Caleb replied, "even if it was reckless. Sometimes reckless is necessary." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his dust-streaked face. "Thomas was a lucky man to have a woman like you." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but they weren't entirely from grief this time. "He used to say the same thing. I never quite believed him." "Believe him," Caleb said quietly. They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear in the clear sky. Eleanor thought about the moment in the tack room, about what might have happened if the door hadn't blown open. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it sent a warm flutter through her chest, like birds taking wing. Tomorrow the town would hear about how she and Caleb had weathered the storm together, alone on the property. The gossips would have a field day, but tonight, with the desert peaceful around them and this complicated, gentle man beside her, Eleanor found she didn't care. Let them talk, she thought. They hadn't been through the storm. They didn't know what it meant to have someone stand beside you when the world tried to blow you away. They didn't know what it was to find unexpected shelter in the middle of chaos. "Eleanor," Caleb's voice was thoughtful. "What you said in the tack room, about me not being just hired help anymore. What did you mean?" She considered her words carefully. "I mean that somewhere between fixing fences and fighting storms, you became more a friend. Maybe someone I trust. And if I'm more than that—" The question was barely a whisper. Eleanor's heart beat hard against her ribs. "Then we'll face that storm when it comes. Together." He reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. They sat that way as darkness fell complete. Two people who had found each other in the wilderness, holding on while the desert wind sang its ancient songs around them. The drought had lasted 3 years, but this summer seemed determined to break all records for cruelty. By late July, the well that had served the homestead faithfully was producing barely enough water for drinking and cooking. The garden Eleanor and Caleb had planted withered despite their careful tending, and the old mare stood listlessly in whatever shade she could find, her ribs beginning to show through her coat. Eleanor stood at the well, pulling up another bucket that was barely half full. The water was murky, with a metallic taste that grew stronger each day. She'd been rationing carefully, but at this rate, they'd be hauling water from town within a week, if they could afford it. "It's going dry," Caleb said behind her. She hadn't heard him approach, but she'd grown used to his quiet ways. "The water table's dropped. This well's not deep enough anymore." Eleanor set the bucket down, trying to keep the despair from her face. "Thomas always said we should dig a new well. Never seemed to be the right time, or we didn't have the money, or—" She trailed off. "Or he died, leaving her with a half bucket of water and a mountain of might-have-beens." "There's water here," Caleb said, surprising her with his certainty. "Just have to dig deep enough to find it. With what money I can't afford to hire a well-digging crew." The $50 she'd promised him was all she had, and he'd more than earned every cent already. Caleb was quiet for a moment, studying the landscape with those thoughtful gray eyes. Then he walked slowly toward the base of the slope that rose behind the house, stopping about 60 yards away. He knelt, placing his palm flat against the ground, then stood and walked in a slow circle, occasionally stopping to examine the sparse vegetation. "Here," he said finally. "There's water here." "How can you possibly know that?" He pointed to a cluster of greasewood bushes. "See how they're greener than the others. And the way the land dips just slightly, water flows underground same as above. My father taught me to read the signs." He looked back at her. "I can dig it." By yourself, that's impossible. Well digging is dangerous work. It takes a crew. I've done it before. It'll take time, but I can do it. He met her eyes steadily. Unless you have a better idea. Eleanor didn't. They both knew it. The next morning, Caleb marked out a circle 6 feet across and began to dig. Eleanor watched from the porch as he broke through the hard-packed surface. Each shovelful of earth a small victory against the desert. By noon, he was waist-deep in the hole, his shirt soaked with sweat. "You'll kill yourself in this heat," Eleanor said, bringing him water from their dwindling supply. "Better than dying of thirst come August," he replied. But he accepted the break, sitting in the shade while she used a damp cloth to wipe the dust from his face. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "It's not part of what I hired you for." "Eleanor." He caught her hand, stilling its motion. "I'm not doing this because you hired me." The words hung between them in the hot air. Eleanor felt her heart skip, but before she could respond, Caleb was already getting to his feet, reaching for the shovel again. Days blended into each other, marked only by the deepening of the hole. When it became too deep for Caleb to throw dirt out directly, they rigged a pulley system using rope and an old wagon wheel. Eleanor worked the rope while Caleb filled buckets below, their movements falling into a rhythm born of necessity and trust. 10 feet, 12, 15. The walls of the hole had to be shored up with precious lumber to prevent cave-ins. More than once, Eleanor's heart stopped as dirt showered down on Caleb below, but he always emerged, dusty and determined. "You're going to dig clear through to China at this rate," Eleanor said one evening, trying for levity as she helped him out of the hole. "Rather find water than China," Caleb replied, accepting the dinner she'd brought out. His hands were raw despite the leather gloves, blistered and bleeding in places. Without asking permission, Eleanor took them in hers, gently cleaning the wounds. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "My family had a farm in Kansas. Good land, plenty of water. When I was 15, a drought hit. Wells went dry one by one. My father spent everything we had trying to find water, hiring crews, buying equipment." His voice went distant. "The bank took the farm. My mother died that winter. Doctor said it was pneumonia, but I think it was heartbreak. My father, he never recovered. Took to drinking. Died in a bar fight 2 years later." Eleanor's hand stilled on his. "I'm sorry." "After that, I drifted. Worked here and there. Never staying long. Figured if you don't put down roots, you can't watch them wither." He looked up at her. "Then I came here, and I saw you fighting the same fight my parents lost. Except you're not giving up." "I wanted to," Eleanor admitted. "Before you came, I was ready to walk away. Let the desert have it all. But you didn't. You hired help instead." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, even if it was from a saloon. "Best decision I ever made," she said, and meant it. 20 feet, 22. The heat was merciless, and their water supply dwindled daily. Eleanor found herself praying with each bucket of earth that came up, praying for the telltale dampness that would mean salvation. On the 7th day, it happened. "Eleanor," Caleb's voice echoed up from the depths, different than she'd ever heard it. "Eleanor, come here." She ran to the hole, peering down into the darkness. Even from above, she could see it. The bottom of the hole was dark with moisture. "It's mud," Caleb called up, his voice cracking with emotion. "We've hit the water table." Eleanor sank to her knees at the edge of the hole, tears streaming down her face. They'd done it, against all odds, with nothing but determination and a shovel. They'd found water. It took another day to dig down far enough for the water to pool properly. Then the work of lining the well with stones began. But that night, they pulled up the first bucket of clear, cold water from the new well. It tasted like salvation. We should celebrate, Eleanor said, giddy with relief. Without thinking, she threw her arms around Caleb, hugging him tight. He stiffened for a moment. Then his arms came around her, holding her carefully, as if she might break. We make a good team, he said against her hair. Yes, she whispered. We do. They stood that way for a long moment, covered in dirt and sweat, holding each other in the desert twilight. When they finally pulled apart, something had shifted between them. Some last barrier washed away like the dirt from their new well. That night, Caleb didn't retreat to the barn after supper. Instead, they sat on the porch, passing a cup of fresh water between them like fine wine, marveling at its sweetness. The Mexicans have a saying. Caleb said, El agua es vida. Water is life. They're right. Eleanor looked out at her property, still struggling, still harsh, but no longer dying of thirst. You gave us life, Caleb. You gave me hope. He turned to her, and in the moonlight she could see everything in his eyes. The loneliness, the longing, the careful hope he'd been hiding. Eleanor, he began, then stopped, struggling for words. I need to tell you something. About why I keep moving, about what I'm running from. Tomorrow, she said, placing her hand over his. Tell me tomorrow. Tonight, let's just be grateful for water. He turned his hand palm up, interlacing their fingers. Tomorrow, then. They sat in silence, hands linked, while overhead the stars wheeled through the desert sky. The new well gurgled softly in the darkness. Its sound like a promise of life, of growth, of possibilities neither of them had dared imagine just weeks before. Eleanor thought about the town gossips, about what they'd say if they could see her now, holding hands with her hired help like a lovesick girl. But their whispers seemed as insignificant as dust compared to what she and Caleb had built together. Not just a well, but a foundation for something deeper, something that could withstand drought and storms and whatever else the desert threw at them. Water is life, she thought, but sometimes the right person at the right time could be salvation itself. The whispers started as a trickle, much like the water from their old well before it ran dry. Eleanor first noticed them during her monthly trip to town for supplies. Conversation stopped mid-sentence when she entered Morrison's general store. Women she'd known for years suddenly found urgent business elsewhere when she approached. The usual order, Mrs. Hayes, Morrison asked, his manner stiffer than normal, eyes not quite meeting hers. Yes, and add some extra flour. We're making good progress on the property. She kept her voice steady, refusing to acknowledge the two women whispering furiously by the fabric display. We, Mrs. Morrison emerged from the back room. Her tone pointed. You and that drifter you hired. Mr. Turner has been invaluable help, Eleanor replied evenly. The new well he dug is already making a difference. I'm sure he's been helpful, Mrs. Morrison said, her meaning clear in the pause. Living out there, just the two of you, people talk. Eleanor. People always have. Eleanor signed for her purchases, her signature firm despite the heat rising in her cheeks. Good day to you both. Outside, she nearly collided with Reverend Matthias and his wife. The minister's face was grave, disappointed, as if Eleanor had personally failed him. Mrs. Hayes, he began. Perhaps you might spare a moment. I'm afraid not. Reverend Mr. Turner is waiting with the wagon. She saw him then, Caleb, standing by their wagon with the studied calm of a man who knew he was being watched and judged. A group of cowboys from the Bar J ranch lounged against the saloon wall, making no effort to hide their interest. Afternoon, Mrs. Hayes. One called out with false friendliness. That's some hired help you got there. Real cozy arrangement, from what we hear. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he kept loading supplies without response. Eleanor climbed onto the wagon seat, back straight, chin high. Let's go home, she said quietly. They rode in silence until the town was well behind them. Then Eleanor let out a shaky breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "I'm sorry," Caleb said. "This is my fault. I should have known." "Known what? That people with nothing better to do would gossip." Eleanor's hands clenched on her lap. "That they'd rather spread poison than see someone trying to survive. That my being there would ruin your reputation." Eleanor turned to face him. "My reputation? I'm a childless widow trying to keep a failing ranch alive. What reputation do I have left to protect? You're a good woman. And you're a good man. That should be all that matters." But they both knew it wasn't that simple. Not in a place where propriety mattered more than survival. Where a woman's worth was measured by her adherence to rules written by those who'd never faced her choices. The next few days brought more signs of trouble. Eleanor found one of her fence posts pulled up, the wire cut. A window shutter that Caleb had just repaired was damaged again, this time clearly by human hands rather than wind. Then Bartholomew Reed paid a visit. Eleanor knew him by reputation more than personal acquaintance. Reed owned the largest ranch in the territory, with enough cattle and hired guns to make him practically a law unto himself. He was somewhere past 50, with silver temples and the confident bearing of a man used to getting his way. She was working in the garden when the dust cloud of his approach appeared. 3 riders, Reed and 2 of his men, hard-faced cowboys with low-slung pistols. "Mrs. Hayes." Reed touched his hat brim, though his smile held no warmth. "Fine morning." "Mr. Reed." She didn't invite him to dismount. "What brings you out this way?" "Neighborly concern." He looked around the property with calculating eyes, taking in the improvements, the new well, the repaired buildings. "Heard you've been having some troubles. Thought I might offer my assistance." "We're managing fine, thank you." His eyebrows rose. "Ah, yes, the drifter, Turner. Isn't it interesting fellow? Been asking about him in town. Nobody seems to know where he came from." Caleb emerged from the barn then, moving with casual purpose, a hammer in his hand. He nodded politely but said nothing. "Mr. Turner has been a great help," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm sure he has." Reed's smile widened. "Still, a woman alone. Times being what they are. I'd like to renew my offer to buy your land. More than fair price. You could start fresh somewhere more suitable. My husband is buried on this land. Mr. Reed, I'm not selling." "Your husband was a practical man. From what I heard, I don't think he'd want you struggling out here, subject to unfortunate situations." His eyes flicked to Caleb. "People in town are concerned about you. Mrs. Hayes, a respectable widow, alone with a stranger. It doesn't look right." "What looks right?" Eleanor said, her voice sharp as the desert wind. "Is a man doing honest work for honest pay. What doesn't look right is cutting fences and damaging property. Know anything about that? Mr. Reed." His face hardened. "That's a serious accusation." "It's a serious problem." They stared at each other while the morning heat built around them. "Finally." Reed touched his hat again. "I'll make one more offer. Mrs. Hayes. Generous terms, cash money. Enough to set you up properly back east. Maybe. Find yourself a new husband. Have those children you never could give Thomas." The words hit like physical blows. Eleanor felt Caleb tense beside her, saw his grip tighten on the hammer. "Get off my land," she said quietly. "Think about it," Reed said, turning his horse. "My patience isn't infinite. Neither is the town's. You're walking a dangerous path. Mrs. Hayes, both of you." After they left, Eleanor sank onto the porch steps, shaking. Caleb sat beside her, careful not to touch. "He's not wrong," he said after a moment. "I'm causing you trouble. You're helping me survive. At what cost, your neighbors turning against you, men like Reed making threats?" He stared at his hands. "I've brought this on you. My past." "Stop," Eleanor turned to him. Whatever you were going to tell me the other night, about what you're running from, I don't care. You hear me? I don't care what you did before you came here. I only care about who you've been since that day in the saloon. Eleanor? No, I won't let them drive you away. Not Reed, not the town gossips, not anyone. She took a breath, steadying herself. Unless you want to go. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out, covering her hand with his. I told you that night by the well. I'm not going anywhere. That evening, as Eleanor prepared supper, she found herself thinking about Thomas. What would he have thought of all this? He'd been a good man, steady and reliable, but conventional in his views. Would he have understood her desperate gamble in hiring Caleb? Would he have seen what she saw in the quiet drifter? Through the window, she watched Caleb working on the corral gate, making it stronger against whatever might come. He moved with purpose now, no longer the wary stranger who'd ridden up to her door. This was his home too, she realized, somewhere between the first fence post and the new well. He'd put down roots neither of them had expected. A rider appeared on the horizon, a single man, moving fast. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. More trouble. But as the rider drew closer, she recognized him. Samuel Chen, who ran the telegraph office in town, a decent man who'd always treated her fairly. Mrs. Hayes, he said, dismounting quickly. I came to warn you. Reed's been stirring folks up in town. There's talk of riding out here, making trouble. Tonight, maybe tomorrow. Claimed you threatened him, that your hired man's a danger to the community. Eleanor's blood ran cold. How many? Dozen, maybe more. Reed's got them convinced you're harboring a criminal. He glanced at Caleb. Who joined them? I don't hold with mob justice. Ma'am, thought you should know. Thank you, Mr. Chen. That took courage. He touched his hat. You helped my wife when she was sick last winter. Brought her soup when nobody else would come near for fear of catching fever. I remember kindness. Mrs. Hayes. After he left, Eleanor and Caleb stood in the gathering dusk, the weight of what was coming settling over them like a shroud. We need to prepare, Caleb said quietly. Prepare for what we can't fight off a mob. No, but we can be ready. And Eleanor. He turned to her, his gray eyes serious. Whatever happens, I won't let them hurt you. I promise you that. She believed him. Standing there with darkness falling and danger approaching, Eleanor believed this man would stand between her and whatever came. The thought should have comforted her. Instead, it terrified her, because she realized she'd rather face a mob than lose him. Together, she said, echoing her words from the night of the storm. Whatever comes, we face it together. He nodded slowly. Together. They went inside to prepare for what might be their last stand. Two people the world said shouldn't be together, ready to defend the small piece of earth they'd made their own. Outside, the desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming rain or coming trouble. Either way, they'd be ready. The night passed without incident, but Eleanor barely slept. Every sound made her reach for Thomas's old rifle propped beside her bed. When dawn finally broke, she found Caleb already awake, standing watch on the porch with his own Winchester across his knees. You should have woken me for a shift, she said, handing him a cup of coffee. Couldn't sleep anyway. He accepted the cup gratefully. Eleanor, there's something I need to tell you. Before they come, you deserve to know what kind of man you've been defending. Eleanor sat beside him, the morning air still cool against her skin. All right, tell me. Caleb stared out at the awakening desert, his jaw working as he searched for words. I told you my father died in a bar fight. That was true. What I didn't say was that I'm the one who killed the man who killed him. Eleanor's breath caught, but she remained silent. His name was Marcus Wade, cattle baron's son from Kansas. He'd been terrorizing folks for years. His daddy's money kept the law away. That night, he was drunk, picking fights. My father tried to calm him down. Caleb's voice went flat. Wade pulled a knife, opened my father's throat right there on the sawdust floor. Oh, Caleb. I was 17, watched it happen. Wade was laughing, wiping the blood off his knife, saying something about teaching trash to mind their place. Caleb's knuckles were white on the rifle stock. I took a bottle from the bar and hit him. Didn't mean to kill him, just wanted him to stop laughing. But he went down wrong. Hit his head on the corner of a table. It was justice, Eleanor said quietly. He murdered your father. Maybe, but his family didn't see it that way. They put a bounty on me. Not official, nothing that would stand up in court. Just word spread through cattle country that there was good money for anyone who brought them Caleb Turner, dead or alive. That's why you keep moving. 8 years now. Thought maybe I'd outrun it, coming this far south. But men like Reed, they have connections everywhere. If he's been asking about me. He turned to her then, his gray eyes full of regret. I've brought killers to your door. Eleanor, I'm so sorry. Eleanor processed this information, turning it over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by water. The man beside her had killed, in anger, in grief, but he had taken a life. She waited for fear or revulsion to come. Instead, all she felt was a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. You were a boy who watched his father murdered, she said finally. You acted in a moment of unbearable pain. That doesn't make you a killer. Caleb, it makes you human. The Wade family won't see it that way. Neither will Reed, if he's figured out who I am. Then we'll face them together. She placed her hand over his. I meant what I said yesterday. I don't care about your past. I care about the man who dug a well to save my home, who protected my animals in a storm, who's shown me more kindness in 2 months than... The sound of approaching horses cut her off. Many horses moving fast. They came like a dust storm, 15 riders spreading out in a semicircle around the front of the property. Reed led them, sitting his horse like a general surveying a battlefield. Eleanor recognized some of the others, cowboys from various ranches, a few townsmen who fancied themselves important. At the edge of the group, she spotted Jake from the saloon, looking uncomfortable but present nonetheless. Morning, Mrs. Hayes, Reed called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. Beautiful day, isn't it? Eleanor and Caleb stood, rifles visible but not raised. State your business, Mr. Reed. Community welfare, you might say. We've had some disturbing news about your hired man here. His smile was sharp as a blade. Seems Mr. Turner isn't quite who he claims to be. I know who he is, Eleanor said clearly. He's the man who's helped me save this ranch. Is he also the man who murdered Marcus Wade in cold blood 8 years ago? Reed's voice rose for the benefit of his audience. The man with blood on his hands, who's been running from justice ever since. Murmurs rippled through the group of riders. Some shifted uneasily in their saddles. Marcus Wade was a killer who murdered Caleb's father. Eleanor shot back. If there was any justice, he would have hanged for it. That's not for you to decide. Reed's mask of civility slipped. Or for him. The boy's a killer. And now he's here, corrupting a decent widow, turning her against her own community. The only one corrupting anything is you. Eleanor said, using people's fears and prejudices to steal what you want. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You want my land. I want order. Reed snapped. Decency, the natural way of things. Not some widow playing at being a man, taking up with killers and outcasts. One of the younger cowboys spoke up nervously. Mr. Reed, maybe we should let the law handle this. The law. Reed laughed harshly. The nearest marshal is 3 days' ride away. We are the law out here, boys. Always have been. Caleb stepped forward, his rifle still lowered but ready. You want me? Reed, I'll come quietly. But you leave Mrs. Hayes alone. She's done nothing wrong. Caleb, no, Eleanor started. Nothing wrong, Reed's voice dripped contempt. She's harbored a fugitive, lived in sin with him, from what decent folks can tell. She's forgotten her place, forgotten what's proper for a woman. That's enough. Eleanor raised Thomas's rifle, not quite pointing it, but making her intention clear. You're on my property. All of you. I'm asking you to leave. Or what? Reed leaned forward in his saddle. You'll shoot us all, you and your killer lover. The tension stretched taut as fence wire. Eleanor could see some of the riders growing nervous, questioning whether they'd signed up for this level of confrontation. But others, Reed's core men, had the eager look of those hoping for violence. Then a new voice cut through the standoff. That's about enough excitement for one morning, don't you think? Everyone turned. Coming up the road was Samuel Chen from the telegraph office. But he wasn't alone. With him rode Judge William Thornberry from the county seat, along with 4 men wearing deputy badges. Judge Thornberry Reed couldn't hide his surprise. What brings you out here? Mr. Chen sent me a rather urgent telegram yesterday, the judge said, dismounting with dignity despite his years. Something about mob justice being planned. As you know, Mr. Reed, I take a dim view of citizens taking the law into their own hands. I heard what you were just doing. The judge's voice was steel-wrapped in courtesy. Making accusations, threatening a widow, planning what exactly, a lynching running people off their legal property. The man's a killer, Reed protested. Wanted in Kansas. Then you should have contacted proper authorities. Judge Thornberry turned to Caleb. Mr. Turner, I'll need to investigate these allegations. Are you willing to cooperate? Caleb glanced at Eleanor, then nodded. Yes, sir. Good. In the meantime, the judge's gaze swept over the assembled riders. Anyone who takes vigilante action will answer to me personally. And I assure you, gentlemen, territorial prison is not pleasant this time of year. The riders began to disperse, some quickly, others with reluctance. Reed remained, his face dark with anger. This isn't over, he told Eleanor. You can't hide behind the law forever. I'm not hiding, Eleanor replied. I'm standing on my own land, with a man who's earned my trust and respect. If that threatens you, Mr. Reed, perhaps you should examine why. Reed's hand twitched toward his sidearm, but one of the deputies cleared his throat meaningfully. With a final glare, Reed wheeled his horse and galloped away, his remaining men following. Judge Thornberry waited until they were gone, then turned to Eleanor and Caleb. Now then, Mr. Turner, I'll need to hear your account of the Wade incident. Mrs. Hayes, Mr. Chen tells me there's been harassment of your property. They spent the next hour giving their accounts. Caleb told his story simply, without excuse or embellishment. The judge listened carefully, occasionally asking pointed questions. The Wade family never filed official charges, he said finally. What they've done instead, this bounty business, that's not legal. Doesn't mean they won't keep trying. But as far as the law is concerned, Mr. Turner, you're not a wanted man in this territory. Eleanor felt weak with relief. Then he can stay. That's between you and him, Mrs. Hayes. But I'll be making it clear that any further harassment of either of you will be dealt with severely. He paused, studying them with knowing eyes. The frontier's changing, maybe slower than some would like. But it is changing. A widow has the right to hire help. A man has the right to work for wages without being hunted for his past. After the judge and his men left, Eleanor and Caleb stood alone in the suddenly quiet morning. The crisis had passed, but they both knew it wasn't truly over. Reed wouldn't give up easily. The town gossips wouldn't suddenly approve. The Wade family might still send hunters. You could have left with them, Eleanor said quietly. Started fresh somewhere they don't know your name. Caleb set his rifle aside and took her hands in his. My name doesn't matter. What matters is this place, this life we're building. What matters is you. Caleb, I love you, Eleanor. The words came out rough, urgent. I know I have no right to say it. I know what people will think, what they already think. But facing down those men, thinking I might lose you, I can't pretend anymore. Eleanor's heart thundered in her chest. I love you too. God help me, I do. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the desert. Eleanor clung to him, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart against hers. What do we do now? She whispered. We live, he said simply. We work the land, raise the animals, draw water from our well. We face whatever comes, but we face it together. Eleanor pulled back to look at him, this man who'd arrived as a drifter and become her anchor, who'd killed to avenge his father but showed gentleness to every living thing in his care, who'd chosen to stand and fight rather than run. Together, she agreed, and sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of coffee and courage and the sweet water of new beginnings. The weeks following the confrontation settled into an uneasy peace, true to Judge Thornberry's warning. Reed kept his distance, though Eleanor sometimes caught sight of his riders watching from the ridgeline. The town remained divided. Some folks, like Samuel Chen and surprisingly Mrs. Morrison, began offering cautious friendliness. Others crossed the street to avoid them entirely. But at the homestead, life bloomed with quiet determination. The new well continued to produce sweet, clear water. The garden, nourished by Caleb's irrigation channels, began to show green shoots of promise. Even the cantankerous old rooster seemed to crow with more vigor, as if sensing the change in the air. One evening, as purple shadows stretched across the desert, Eleanor found Caleb standing by the new well, staring down into its depths. Thinking deep thoughts, she asked. Joining him? He smiled. Those smiles came easier now, warming his face in ways that still made her heart skip. Thinking about water, about roots, about things that run deeper than what folks can see on the surface. And what do you see down there? Possibility. He turned to her, his gray eyes serious. Eleanor, I need to ask you something. I've been carrying this around for days, trying to find the right words. Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. Ask. Instead of speaking immediately, Caleb walked to his saddlebags, still kept in the barn, though his horse now grazed freely, no longer ready for sudden flight. He returned with something small wrapped in faded cloth. This was my mother's, he said, unwrapping it to reveal a simple gold ring, worn thin but still gleaming. She gave it to my father when they married. He gave it back to her when she was dying, asked her to keep it safe for the woman I'd marry someday. Eleanor's breath caught. Caleb? I know what people will say. A widow barely a year bereaved, taking up with hired help. A drifter, a man with blood on his hands. He met her eyes steadily. But I also know what we've built here, what we could keep building. I'm not Thomas, Eleanor. I can't promise you an easy life or respectability or children, but I can promise you'll never face another storm alone. Eleanor looked at him, this man who'd arrived with dust on his boots and wariness in his eyes, who'd dug deep to find water and deeper still to find trust, who'd offered to leave to protect her reputation and stayed to protect her life. Yes, she said simply. Yes, Caleb Turner. I'll marry you. Let them talk. Let them whisper and judge and clutch their pearls. We've already survived drought and storms and men with guns. What's a little gossip compared to that? He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly. It fit as if made for her. This simple band that had traveled so far to find its home. When? He asked, pulling her close. Soon, before Reed thinks up new mischief, before courage fails. She smiled against his chest. Before that preacher in town comes up with enough sermons about propriety to talk us out of it. They were married 3 days later, Not in town where disapproving eyes would mar the moment, but at the homestead, with Judge Thornberry officiating. Samuel Chen stood as witness, along with his wife and, surprisingly, Jake from the saloon. "Figured a man who digged that deep for water wouldn't run out on a woman," Jake said gruffly, shaking Caleb's hand after the brief ceremony. Eleanor wore her best dress, the one she'd been saving for some undefined special occasion. Caleb had shaved carefully and beaten the dust from his one good shirt. They stood by the new well as they spoke their vows, the desert wind playing witness to promises of love and loyalty. "By the power vested in me by the territory of New Mexico," Judge Thornberry intoned, a slight smile playing at his lips. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." They kissed there in the afternoon sun, sealing a bond that had been forged in harder fires than any wedding ceremony could provide. When they parted, Eleanor saw tears in Caleb's eyes, this man who'd faced down mobs and killing drought with steady calm. "No regretting this later," she teased gently. "Never," he said fiercely. "Not for a single moment." The small wedding party shared a meal Eleanor had prepared. Nothing fancy, but made with love and the vegetables finally thriving in their garden. As the sun set, their guests departed with congratulations and warnings to be careful, leaving the newlyweds alone. They stood together on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The ring on Eleanor's finger caught the last light, a small defiance against all who'd tried to tear them apart. "Mrs. Turner," Caleb said softly, testing the sound of it. "I like it," Eleanor decided. "Though the town will have opinions about me taking a new name so soon. When have you ever cared what the town thinks?" "Fair point." She leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of her husband beside her. "What now?" "Now we prove them all wrong. We make this place thrive. We show that love and hard work matter more than their rules about what's proper." A coyote howled in the distance, that wild sound that had once frightened Eleanor but now seemed like an old friend's greeting. The desert was still harsh, still unforgiving, but no longer empty, no longer hopeless. "Caleb," she said after a comfortable silence. "Thank you." "For what?" "For stopping when you did, for taking a chance on a desperate widow's offer, for staying when leaving would have been easier." He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something. That day in the saloon I had exactly $3 to my name. I'd been running so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stop. When you walked in, proud and determined despite everything against you, I thought if anyone could make me believe in staying put, it might be you. And do you believe in it?" "I believe in us," he said simply. "I believe in this land we're working. I believe in the water we found together. And I believe that sometimes the thing you're running from is actually running towards something better." Eleanor kissed him then, pouring all her love and gratitude and hope into the connection. When they finally went inside, it was to the bedroom they would now share, to the life they would build together day by day, season by season. Outside, the new well gurgled softly in the darkness, its water rising from hidden depths to nourish the earth above. In the barn, Caleb's horse whickered contentedly, no longer saddled for quick escape. The desert wind whispered through the mesquite and sage, carrying stories of survival and transformation. And in the small homestead where a widow's desperate gamble had become a love story, two people who'd found each other against all odds settled in for their first night as husband and wife. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Reed's resentment hadn't disappeared. The drought wasn't truly broken, and there was still so much work to do. But tonight, with her husband's arms around her and their future spreading before them like an uncharted map, Eleanor Turner allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. Complete, bone-deep, unshakable hope. The kind that runs as deep as water in the desert. The kind that no storm can uproot. The kind that two people build together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of faith at a time. In years to come, the story would be told in bunkhouses and general stores, how a childless widow paid $50 for a young cowboy and ended up with far more than hired help. How they faced down the powerful and the prejudiced. How they found water in a drought and love in a landscape that seemed to forbid it. But for now, in the quiet of their desert home, Eleanor and Caleb Turner simply held each other and listened to the sound of their well bringing life to the land. It sounded like promises kept, like roots growing deep, like home. Thank you so much for joining me on this Wild West journey of love, courage, and redemption. If you enjoyed Eleanor and Caleb's story, I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Leave a comment below and let's connect across the miles, just like our frontier heroes connected across the desert. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales of romance and adventure from America's untamed frontier. What did you think of Eleanor's courage and Caleb's transformation? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Happy trails, partners.